How 2000 quietly ended the world. What if I told you the world ended on New Year's Eve 1999 and nobody noticed? What if the Y2K fix worked so well that it quietly swapped our reality for another one, leaving only the smallest traces behind? Leave your video ideas in the comments below, and like and subscribe to Sleep Theories if you enjoy these stories. My name is Marcus Webb, or at least it used to be. According to my driver's license now, there's an extra B in there somewhere, though I can't say exactly where it belongs. That's the kind of detail that would have driven me insane before December 31st, 1999. Now it's just another entry in what I used to call my coincidence tin, before someone mailed it back to me with a note that made me stop collecting evidence entirely. I was 26 that winter, a junior systems technician at the AT&T central office in Newark, New Jersey. Not exactly the front lines of the information age, but close enough to matter when the clocks needed babysitting. Our facility housed a Stratum 1 network time protocol server, one of maybe 50 primary time sources in North America, fed by GPS satellites and backed up by a cesium atomic clock that cost more than my house. The setup was elegant in that brutally practical way that telecommunications infrastructure tends to be. GPS satellites broadcast precise time signals, our cesium oscillator provided local backup, and our NTP server distributed synchronized time to thousands of downstream systems across the eastern seaboard. Banks, power grids, air traffic control, they all traced their chronometers back through a hierarchy of time servers that ultimately led to places like ours. I loved the precision of it. While most people worried about their microwaves blinking 12 o'clock after power outages, I monitored time accuracy measured in nanoseconds. My workstation displayed graphs showing the tiny corrections our system made as it reconciled network time with atomic time with astronomical time. Usually the variations were so small they looked like flat lines. New Year's Eve 1999 was supposed to be the ultimate test of that precision. Everyone remembers Y2K differently now. The popular version is either complete hysteria over nothing, or a crisis averted by heroic programming efforts. Both versions miss the real story, which is that the fix worked exactly as designed, just not the way anyone expected. I drew the short straw for overnight duty that December 31st. While the rest of the world either panicked or partied, I sat in a climate-controlled room watching time itself transition from the 20th century to the 21st. My job was simple: monitor our Stratum 1 server as it rolled over from 1999 to 2000, document any anomalies, and call the escalation chain if anything looked wrong. The GPS constellation had already survived its own rollover crisis that August, when the satellite's week counters reset after 1,024 weeks of operation. That had been a minor blip. Some older receivers got confused for a few hours, but nothing catastrophic. The Y2K transition was supposed to be even smoother, since most of the critical infrastructure had been patched months earlier. I had 3 monitors running, one showing our local NTP server status, one tracking the GPS time feed, and one displaying the cesium clock output. At 23:59:50 UTC, everything looked perfect. 10 seconds later, something impossible happened. The GPS time display froze at 23:59:59. Not crashed, frozen. The timestamp stopped updating, but the signal strength remained solid. Meanwhile, our cesium clock kept ticking normally, advancing through 23:59:59 to 0, 0000 to 000001. For exactly 2 seconds, we had 3 different versions of now running simultaneously. The frozen GPS time, the advancing cesium time, and our NTP server's output, which seemed to be averaging all available sources. Then, at what should have been 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 2 seconds on January 1st, 2000, the GPS feed resumed, not gradually, instantly. The timestamp jumped from 23:59:59 to 00002 in a single refresh cycle. Our NTP server smoothly incorporated the change and continued broadcasting synchronized time to its downstream clients. The whole event lasted less than 3 seconds. According to the logs, nothing broke. No error conditions were triggered. The NTP daemon didn't even register the discrepancy as significant enough to note in its status reports. If I hadn't been watching the raw feeds, I might have missed it entirely. I took screenshots of everything. The frozen GPS display, the cesium timeline, the NTP server logs showing 2 seconds of missing data that appeared as a flat plateau on the usual sawtooth correction graph. Then I printed hard copies, because something in my gut told me digital records might not be reliable for this particular anomaly. At 0030 I called my supervisor Jim Reeves at home. "Everything nominal here," I told him. "Clean rollover, no service interruptions. We did see a brief GPS time hold around midnight UTC, but the cesium backup covered it perfectly." "How brief?" Jim asked. I could hear the skepticism in his voice. GPS systems weren't supposed to hold time like that. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Looked like the constellation might have synchronized some kind of coordinated correction. Nothing downstream noticed. "Good enough," Jim said. "Document it in the incident log as a minor GPS anomaly. Resolved automatically. We'll review the traces Monday." But Monday's review never happened. When I arrived at work on January 3rd, Jim seemed to have forgotten our conversation entirely. When I mentioned the GPS hold event, he looked at me blankly. "GPS looked fine in the overnight reports," he said. "What hold are you talking about?" I showed him my screenshots and printouts. He studied them for a long moment, then shrugged. "Weird artifact in the logging system, probably. These old displays get glitchy when they roll over large counters. Everything's working fine now, right?" Everything was working fine, but small things were wrong. The first thing I noticed was the diner across the street from our building. For 3 years, I'd bought coffee there every morning from a place called Mel's Corner Cafe. The sign still said Mel's, but now there was additional text underneath. Family restaurant since 1987. I was certain that text hadn't been there before. When I mentioned it to Tommy Nguyen, the other night shift tech, he looked at me like I was crazy. "It's the best we can do." The cesium clock sits in its locked cabinet, still keeping perfect time according to atomic decay rather than administrative convenience. Sometimes I think about opening that cabinet, checking its output against the network feeds, seeing how far we've drifted from the original timeline. But that way leads back to collection tins and evidence folders, and the gradual dissolution of consensus reality. Instead, I focus on the work, training new technicians, monitoring synchronization networks, ensuring that when the next major adjustment comes, and it will come, probably sooner than any of us would like, the infrastructure will be ready to handle it smoothly. Lake calls me every few months, usually just before a minor calibration. The conversations are brief and professional now, more like status updates between colleagues than the cryptic warnings they used to be. We've developed an efficient working relationship based on mutual understanding. I maintain operational consistency, she manages strategic timeline stability, and together we keep the world running on schedule. Last week she mentioned that they're developing new protocols for managing what she calls temporal stress fractures, places where repeated adjustments have created persistent instabilities that resist normal correction methods. Apparently there's a shopping mall in Ohio where every store directory shows different tenant lists depending on which entrance you use, and a highway in Nevada where the mile markers reset every few months but the road itself never changes length. "We're looking for experienced field personnel," she said. "People who understand both the technical infrastructure and the human adaptation requirements." Interested? I told her I'd think about it. Tonight, as I finish my shift and lock the server room behind me, I notice that someone has finally replaced the wall clocks. The new ones are digital, showing hours, minutes and seconds in precise LED numerals. No sweeping hands, no mechanical uncertainty, just clean, unambiguous timekeeping that updates once per second in perfect synchronization with our network feeds. The young technician on the incoming shift, a recent graduate named David Kim, notices me looking at them. "Pretty nice upgrade," he says. "Much easier to read than those old analog things." "Yeah," I agree, "much easier." I don't mention that the old clocks never had second hands. He wouldn't understand, and more importantly, it doesn't matter anymore. We live in the timeline where digital wall clocks make perfect sense, where precision timing is displayed precisely, where the infrastructure tells a consistent story about how time works. Walking to my car in the pre-dawn darkness, I hear the familiar hum of the timing system settling into their new configuration, adjusting frequencies and synchronizing references across the continental network. It's a sound that most people will never notice, the quiet heartbeat of managed reality maintaining its steady rhythm. The receipt for our choice is stamped on every clock face, encoded in every timestamp, woven into the fundamental architecture of how we measure the passage of time. We traded a little bit of objective truth for a lot of functional stability, and most days I think we got the better end of the deal. But as I drive home through the empty streets of Newark, passing under signs that might or might not say exactly what they said yesterday, I sometimes wonder what Marcus Webb, without the J, without the extra letter, without the knowledge of how provisional everything really is, would think of the world we've built. He'd probably never noticed the difference. And maybe that's the point. The world didn't end on December 31st, 1999. It just swapped transmissions at highway speed so smoothly that most of the passengers never felt the shift. We're still travelling in the same direction, still reaching the same destinations, still living lives that feel authentic and meaningful. We're just doing it in a slightly different version of reality than the one we started with, maintained by a hidden infrastructure of timekeepers who make sure the clocks stay synchronized and the seams stay sealed. It's not the world we were born into, but it's the world we chose to keep. And after 9 years of living in it, I can honestly say that it's a pretty good world. Stable, functional, and carefully maintained by people who understand that sometimes the most important truths are the ones nobody ever needs to know. The cesium clock in my desk drawer ticks away in perfect atomic rhythm, marking time according to the fundamental decay rate of cesium-133 atoms, rather than human administrative convenience. Someday, maybe, someone will need that reference again, but for now it's enough to know that it's there, keeping one small piece of objective time safe in a world built on consensus and compromise. Time keeps moving forward, one carefully managed second at a time, carrying all of us toward whatever future we'll choose to inhabit when the next adjustment becomes necessary. And somewhere in the background, barely audible above the hum of servers and the whisper of air conditioning, reality continues its quiet work of staying consistent with itself, one synchronized timestamp at a time. Always said that, Marcus. You walk past it every day. I know what I've seen, I said. Maybe you just never noticed. People miss obvious stuff all the time. But I was a time technician. My entire job was noticing tiny discrepancies. I didn't miss obvious stuff. Over the following weeks, more small wrongnesses accumulated. My employee ID badge, which I'd carried for 2 years, now listed my name as Marcus J. Webb instead of just Marcus Webb. I didn't have a middle name, never had, but the badge looked genuine. Same photo, same issue date, same magnetic stripe encoding. I checked my driver's license. It also showed Marcus J. Webb, with what appeared to be the original lamination and printing, but I distinctly remembered not having a middle initial on either document. Tommy insisted he'd always known me as Marcus J. What does the J stand for? I asked him. I don't know, man. You never said. Why are you being so weird about this? I started carrying a small digital camera, documenting things that seemed off. The corridor outside our server room had always been painted institutional beige, but now there was a 6-inch strip of slightly different beige paint running along the east wall, as if someone had covered over where a window or door used to be. The paint was old, not fresh, but it didn't match the surrounding wall. When I asked the building maintenance supervisor about it, he told me there had never been any windows or doors on that wall. Been the same configuration for 15 years, he said. You feeling okay, Webb? I was feeling fine. It was reality that seemed to be running a fever. 3 weeks after Y2K, an unmarked manila envelope appeared in my work mailbox. Inside was a single sheet of letterhead from something called the Temporal Continuity Office, and what looked like an internal field advisory. The memo was brief. Field Advisory TC 2000-001. Classification, Administrative Date. 2. January 2000 Subject. Successful completion of scheduled UTC alignment. All critical staff are commended for the successful implementation of a multi-source holdover during the 31st of December 1999 epoch transition. coordinated time synchronization between astronomical, atomic and network sources was maintained within acceptable parameters. Minor calibration artifacts at edge nodes are expected and will resolve through standard stratum propagation over the coming months. Field personnel should maintain consistency in reporting and avoid speculation regarding minor administrative discrepancies. Questions regarding this advisory should be directed through normal channels. Temporal Continuity Office, US Naval Observatory. I read the memo 3 times, then researched the Naval Observatory online. They were responsible for maintaining the United States master clock, which made sense, but I couldn't find any references to a Temporal Continuity Office in any of their public organisational charts. The phrase multi-source holdover stuck with me. In network timing, holdover referred to a backup system maintaining synchronization when the primary reference failed. But what kind of holdover involved multiple sources simultaneously? And what were these minor calibration artifacts at edge nodes? I started paying closer attention to our system logs, looking for patterns. What I found was a series of small firmware updates that had been pushed to our NTP server and GPS receiver starting in early January. The updates came through normal channels with proper authentication, but the release notes were vague. GPS receiver firmware V 4.2.1, enhanced leap second handling NTP daemon, update 2000.1.3, improved stratum one-time smearing algorithm cesium clock controller version 1.8, extended holdover stability. None of us had requested these updates. More importantly, the features they described hadn't existed before. Time smearing was a concept I'd never encountered in any NTP documentation, and our cesium clock had never had extended holdover capabilities. When I asked Jim about the updates, he seemed surprised that I was questioning routine maintenance. Probably just Y2K follow-up patches, he said, making sure everything stays synchronized properly. Why is something not working? Everything was working perfectly. That was the problem. By March, I had assembled what I privately called my coincidence tin, a small metal box containing printed screenshots, photos of changed signs, photocopies of documents that didn't match my memory, and detailed notes about every small wrongness I'd observed. I kept it locked in my desk drawer and told no one about it. The evidence was mounting, but it was all circumstantial. Individual pieces could be explained away as faulty memory, printing errors, or simple mistakes. Collectively, though, they suggested something much stranger. That the world I was living in wasn't quite the same world I'd inhabited on December 30th, 1999. The theory forming in my mind was ridiculous, but it was also the only explanation that fit all the facts. The 2-second GPS time hold hadn't been a malfunction. It had been intentional, a coordinated pause that allowed some kind of temporal recalibration to occur. The minor calibration artifacts mentioned in the memo weren't bugs, they were side effects. Someone had adjusted reality itself and they'd used the global timing infrastructure to do it. In April, I got confirmation that I wasn't crazy. I was reviewing our March logs when I noticed something odd in the air traffic control data feeds that passed through our facility. There was a brief notation at 14:32:18 on March 15th. ATC vector hold, software update. The timestamp was followed by a 2-second gap in the feed, then normal traffic resumed. I'd worked with ATC systems before. They didn't hold vectors for software updates. When air traffic control needed to update systems, they used redundant controllers and hot swaps to avoid any interruption in service. A 2-second hold would ground every aircraft in the affected airspace. But according to the logs, no aircraft had been grounded that day. The hold had happened, yet it also hadn't happened. I called the regional ATC facility claiming I needed to verify our time synchronization data for their sector. "Did you folks experience any service interruptions on March 15th? I asked the technician who answered. "March 15th? There was a pause. "No, we had a clean day." "Why?" "Our logs show a brief vector hold around 14:30 that afternoon. Just wanted to make sure it wasn't related to our time feed." "Hold on," I heard keyboard typing. "I'm not seeing any holds that day. You sure about your timestamp?" "Pretty sure. 2-second duration, marked as software update." "That doesn't make sense." We don't hold vectors for software updates. His tone had shifted from helpful to suspicious. Who did you say you were with again? AT&T Timing Services. We provide NTP synchronization for your... Right. Look, I can't discuss operational details with external vendors. If there's a synchronization issue, have your account manager contact our network operations center through proper channels. He hung up before I could respond. That evening I found my coincidence tin on my desk. I was certain I'd left it locked in the drawer, but there it was, sitting in plain sight. Inside was everything I'd collected, plus one new item, a photograph of our server room wall clocks. In the photo, all 6 clocks were missing their second hands. I looked up at the actual wall clocks. Sure enough, none of them had second hands. They showed only hours and minutes, in the same utilitarian style they'd always had, but without the sweeping red hands that had once marked every second with mechanical precision. I grabbed my camera and took comparison photos, then checked my earlier shots of the room. In every image I'd captured before March, the clocks had second hands. In every image after March, they didn't. Attached to the new photograph was a small note typewritten on plain paper. You left out the obvious one. Someone was watching me. Someone knew about my collection and had access to my workspace. Someone who wanted me to notice the clocks but was being subtle about it. I locked the tin away and spent the rest of the night researching the US Naval Observatory online. What I found was fascinating. They were responsible not just for keeping official time, but for distributing it to military and civilian systems worldwide. They operated the GPS Master Control Station, maintained the definitive UTC clock for the United States, and coordinated with international timing authorities to ensure global synchronization. If someone wanted to adjust time on a planetary scale, the Naval Observatory would be ground zero. The next morning I found another unmarked envelope in my mailbox. This one contained a visitor badge for the US Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., valid for a single day the following week, and a brief note. Building 78, Conference Room C, 2 p.m. Ask for Lake. I almost didn't go. Whatever was happening, it was clearly bigger than a junior telecom technician needed to be involved in. But curiosity won over caution, and the following Thursday I took a personal day and drove down to Washington. The Naval Observatory occupied a sprawling campus in northwest DC, filled with serious-looking buildings and precise landscaping. I presented my visitor badge at the main gate, went through a security screening that seemed unusually thorough for a civilian facility, and was directed to Building 78. Conference Room C was small and windowless, furnished with a simple table and chairs. I waited alone for 10 minutes before a woman in her 50s entered, carrying a thick folder and wearing the kind of confident expression that suggested she was accustomed to explaining complicated things to confuse people. "Mr. Webb," she said, extending her hand, "thank you for coming. I'm Jennifer Lake." She didn't use any title, but something about her bearing suggested she was used to being in charge. She wore a simple business suit and spoke with the precise diction of someone who spent a lot of time briefing senior officials. "I understand you've been collecting interesting timing data," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "Depends what you mean by interesting." She opened her folder and spread several documents on the table. I recognised some of them immediately. My screenshots from New Year's Eve, printouts of the GPS time hold, copies of the firmware release notes. Others were new to me. Technical diagrams, satellite telemetry reports, and what looked like coordination memos between various government agencies. The GPS constellation experienced a coordinated time adjustment on December 31st, 1999, she said, matter-of-factly. 2 seconds were inserted into the global timing reference to reconcile discrepancies between astronomical time and atomic time that had accumulated over the previous decade. I stared at her. "You're telling me that was intentional?" "Completely intentional, and absolutely necessary." She pulled out a graph showing the divergence between different time standards over the 1990s. Coordinated universal time is based on atomic clocks, but it's supposed to track Earth's rotation. The problem is that Earth doesn't rotate at a perfectly consistent rate. Over time, the two references drift apart. I knew about leap seconds, the occasional 1-second adjustments that were added to UTC to keep it aligned with astronomical time, but what she was describing was something much more significant. 2 seconds is a huge correction, I said. Why not use the normal leap second process? Because the normal process was insufficient, Lake said. By late 1999, the accumulated error was approaching 3 seconds, and the International Earth Rotation Service was deadlocked on how to handle it. Some wanted to add 2 leap seconds consecutively. Others wanted to skip leap seconds entirely and let the systems drift. Neither option was acceptable. She showed me another document, a risk assessment that made my stomach drop. A 2 leap second event would have caused cascading failures in financial systems that weren't designed to handle consecutive corrections. But allowing the drift to continue would have gradually desynchronized GPS navigation, cellular networks, and power grid controllers. So you decided to handle it yourselves, I said. We decided to handle it properly. Instead of forcing every system in the world to absorb a sudden 2-second correction, we distributed the adjustment across multiple primary time sources over a brief coordination window. GPS satellites held their time broadcast while ground-based atomic clocks continued advancing. Network time protocol servers averaged the 2 references, creating a smooth transition that downstream systems barely noticed. It was elegant, I had to admit. Instead of a jarring leap that could break fragile systems, they created what amounted to a 2-second stretch in time itself, distributed so gradually that most equipment treated it as normal synchronization error. But there were side effects, I said. Lake nodded grimly. Reality has a certain inertia. When you adjust fundamental references like time, energy has to go somewhere. Usually it dissipates harmlessly through minor inconsistencies in data records, small variations in measurement standards, trivial administrative discrepancies. Usually, the January adjustment was larger than we'd ever attempted. Some of the energy manifested as more noticeable artifacts, names with extra letters, signs that read slightly differently, paint seams where building modifications were averaged across timeline variants. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Timeline variants? Think of it as data reconciliation on a cosmic scale, Lake said. When you force multiple time references to converge, sometimes you get multiple versions of events trying to exist simultaneously. Usually one version dominates and the others fade, but occasionally you get persistent inconsistencies, places where reality couldn't quite decide which version was correct. She showed me a map of North America with dozens of red dots scattered across it. Every red dot represents a location where we detected significant timeline artifacts after the January adjustment. Most were minor, street signs, building details, personal records. A few were more substantial. How substantial? There's a small town in Montana where half the residents remember the local high school mascot being the Eagles, and half remember it being the Hawks. The trophy case contains awards for both teams, with dates that overlap. The yearbook photos show both versions of the uniforms, often in the same group shots. I thought about my extra middle initial, the diner sign, the missing window that had never existed. And you just let people live with that? The alternative was a global economic collapse followed by societal breakdown, Lake said bluntly. 2 seconds doesn't sound like much, but financial trading algorithms operate on microsecond timescales. A sudden 2-second leap would have destroyed market synchronization worldwide. Air traffic control, power grid management, telecommunications routing, all of it depends on precise timing. We prevented a true catastrophe. By creating a false reality, by choosing which version of reality we wanted to keep. Her expression was completely serious. The January adjustment wasn't the first time we've had to make this choice, and it won't be the last. The Earth keeps slowing down, atomic clocks keep advancing, and every few years the discrepancy builds up enough to require intervention. She pulled out another document, this one showing projected timeline adjustments extending into the future. September 2001, March 2005, October 2008. We've identified the dates when major corrections will be necessary. Each one will be carefully planned and minimally disruptive, but they'll all leave traces. What happens to people like me? People who notice? That depends on what you do with the information. Lake leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully. Collections become narratives. Narratives add energy to the seams. The more attention you pay to timeline inconsistencies, the more unstable they become. I thought about my coincidence tin, my photographs, my careful documentation of every small wrongness. You want me to stop collecting evidence? I want you to understand that your evidence collection is making the problem worse. Every time you photograph a timeline seam, every time you document an inconsistency, you're feeding energy into the instability. Eventually that energy has to dissipate, and it usually does so by creating larger, more obvious discrepancies. She showed me a photograph that made my hands shake. It was my apartment building, but wrong. The fire escape was on the opposite side, the brick was different colours, and there were windows where walls should be. This is what your building looks like in the timeline where you never worked for AT&T, Lake said. The more you focus on timeline artifacts, the more likely you are to slip into variant realities where larger aspects of your life are different. So I should just pretend nothing happened? You should focus on consistency rather than accuracy. When you notice something that seems wrong, don't document it, adapt to it. If your name has an extra letter, use the extra letter. If a sign reads differently than you remember, accept the new reading. The goal isn't to be right, it's to avoid destabilizing the reality we've chosen to inhabit. She gathered up the documents and returned them to her folder. This briefing is a one-time courtesy, Mr. Webb. We've identified you as someone with unusual sensitivity to timeline artifacts, which means you could be either an asset or a liability. The choice is yours. And if I choose to be a liability? Lake's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Then you'll discover just how far timeline variance can drift from the consensus reality. Most people who make that choice spend the rest of their lives trying to convince others that their version of events is the correct one. It's not a pleasant way to live. She stood and walked to the door, then paused. "We'll be in touch," she said. I drove back to Newark in a daze, my mind reeling from everything Lake had told me. The world I thought I knew was apparently just one of many possible versions, maintained by a secret conspiracy of timekeepers who made regular adjustments to prevent societal collapse. That night I sat in my apartment staring at my coincidence tin, trying to decide what to do. The evidence I'd collected was either proof of the most significant cover-up in human history, or documentation of my own gradual detachment from reality. Either way, Lake was right about one thing. Focusing on it was driving me towards something I might not be able to come back from. I destroyed everything. Every photograph, every printout, every careful notation. I fed it all into my fireplace and watched it burn. Then I went to work the next day and acted like nothing had happened. But I kept watching. I couldn't help myself. Over the following months, I noticed the small adjustments Lake had mentioned. Firmware updates that arrived without explanation, adding features that shouldn't have existed. Brief system holds that didn't appear in official logs. Colleagues whose names had gained or lost letters, who remembered different details about shared experiences. The most obvious change was the wall clocks in our server room. Not only were the second hands missing, but no one else seemed to remember them ever being there. When I asked Tommy about it, he looked at me like I was having a breakdown. "Why would a wall clock need a second hand?" he asked. "You've got precision timing displays right there on your workstation. The wall clocks are just for rough reference." It was perfectly logical, except that I remembered 6 months of watching those red second hands sweep around their faces while I waited for systems to boot or processes to complete. Now that level of precision seemed unnecessary, even slightly obsessive. Reality was smoothing itself out, erasing the seams one small detail at a time. September 11th, 2001 changed everything again, but not in the way I expected. I was monitoring our systems that morning when the news broke about the attacks in New York and Washington. Along with everyone else, I spent the day glued to television screens, watching the towers fall and trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. But I also noticed something else. A brief system hold at 10:28 a.m. lasting exactly 2 seconds, followed by a subtle shift in our GPS time reference. It was the same pattern I'd seen on New Year's Eve 1999, but smaller and more focused. That evening I received a phone call at home. "Mr. Webb, this is Jennifer Lake. I hope you're doing well." I hadn't heard from her since our meeting at the Naval Observatory more than a year earlier. "I'm fine," I said. Why are you calling? I wanted to make sure you understood what you observed today. The timeline adjustment was necessary to maintain stability during a period of extreme social stress. Without it, the emotional energy of national trauma could have caused significant reality fluctuations. I hadn't told anyone about the system hold. The fact that she knew I'd noticed it was unsettling. How many people died in the version of events that you prevented? I asked. There was a long pause. That's not how timeline adjustments work, Mr. Webb. We don't prevent or cause events. We simply ensure that the timeline remains stable enough to contain them. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share, even with cooperative personnel. After that, the calls became regular. Every few months, Lake would contact me before or after a timeline adjustment, usually just to check in and make sure I was maintaining consistency in my observations. She never provided detailed explanations, but I learned to recognise the pattern. Social or economic stress would build up. A careful 2-second adjustment would occur in our timing systems, and minor aspects of reality would shift to accommodate whatever changes were necessary to maintain stability. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the Virginia Tech shooting in 2007. Each tragedy was preceded or followed by subtle timeline adjustments, smoothing out the rough edges of history to prevent cascading instabilities. I stopped thinking of them as cover-ups and started thinking of them as maintenance. Reality, it turned out, required regular calibration to keep running smoothly. By 2008, I had been promoted to Senior Systems Technician and was training junior staff on proper time synchronization procedures. I made sure to emphasize consistency over accuracy, teaching them to trust the network references even when their personal observations seemed to contradict the official timeline. If your logs show something that doesn't match what you remember, I would tell them, trust the logs. Human memory is unreliable, but atomic clocks don't lie. It wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough to keep them from noticing the seams. In September 2008, Lake called me with a different kind of request. We're planning a major timeline adjustment to prevent economic cascade failure, she said. The housing market collapse is threatening to destabilize financial systems worldwide. We need to smooth the transition to prevent total societal breakdown. What kind of adjustment? Larger than anything we've attempted since Y2K. We're looking at a coordinated hold across multiple time sources, possibly lasting up to 5 seconds. I understood the implications immediately. A 5-second adjustment would create timeline artifacts far more noticeable than anything I'd observed before. Street names could change, building layouts could shift, entire relationships might be rewritten. We'd like to offer you a consulting position, Lake continued. Full-time work with the Temporal Continuity Office, helping to coordinate timeline adjustments and manage artifact containment. The pay is excellent, and you'd be contributing to global stability in a very meaningful way. What would I have to do? Retire your current evidence collection activities permanently, sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, and help us train the next generation of timeline stewards. People like you, who have natural sensitivity to temporal inconsistencies, but also understand the importance of maintaining consensus reality. It was an attractive offer. I was tired of living in the space between versions of truth, tired of noticing things I couldn't discuss, tired of being the only person who remembered that wall clocks used to have second hands. There's one condition, Lake added. The cesium clock in your facility, the one that's been serving as your personal verification standard, would need to be returned to our custody. As long as you have access to an independent time reference, you'll continue to notice discrepancies. For your own mental stability, that's not sustainable long term. I looked across the server room at the cesium clock, quietly ticking away in its climate-controlled cabinet. For almost 9 years, it had been my anchor to objective reality, the one reference I could trust when everything else seemed negotiable. How do I know you won't just adjust my memory along with everything else? Because memory adjustment is significantly more dangerous than timeline calibration, Lake said. We prefer willing cooperation to forced compliance, but the choice has to be complete, Mr. Webb. You can't keep one foot in each reality. I thought about the junior technicians I was training, the smooth efficiency of our time distribution systems, the stable world that surrounded us despite the regular maintenance required to keep it running. It was a good life, built on a foundation of small, necessary lies. When do you need an answer? The economic adjustment is scheduled for October 15th. We'll need you committed before then, one way or another. 2 weeks later, I locked the cesium clock away in a storage cabinet and stopped monitoring our raw time feeds. I signed the non-disclosure agreement, accepted the consulting position, and began teaching other timeline-sensitive individuals how to maintain consistency rather than pursue accuracy. The October adjustment went smoothly. The Lehman Brothers bankruptcy was contained, the housing market collapse was managed, and the global financial system remained stable, not unharmed, but functional. Most people experienced it as a severe recession rather than the complete civilizational breakdown that the unmanaged timeline would have produced. I noticed the artifacts, of course, street names that had changed, colleagues whose personal histories had shifted, subtle modifications to building layouts and document records. But I didn't document them, didn't photograph them, didn't add them to any collection tin. Instead, I adapted. When someone's name gained or lost a letter, I used the new spelling. When a familiar building showed different architectural details, I accepted the new configuration. When my own employment record showed assignments I didn't remember, I incorporated them into my personal narrative. It became easier with practice. The human mind is remarkably adaptable, and reality is far more flexible than most people imagine. After a few years of active consistency maintenance, the seams between timeline variants became almost invisible to me. Almost. There are still moments, usually late at night in the server room, when I catch glimpses of the infrastructure we maintain. The NTP graphs show their periodic flat plateaus where time holds still for a few seconds. Firmware updates arrive, adding features that shouldn't exist but somehow do. Wall clocks throughout the building continue to lack second hands that I'm absolutely certain used to be there. And sometimes, when the timing systems are synchronizing after a major adjustment, I hear something that might be the sound of reality switching tracks. A low, harmonic hum that exists just at the edge of perception, like the Doppler shift of a massive train passing in the distance. The new timeline technicians I train never notice it. They've learned to trust the network, accept the logs, maintain consistency over accuracy. They're building the next generation of global time infrastructure, adding layers of abstraction that will make future adjustments even smoother and less noticeable. It's good work, important work. We're maintaining the technical foundation that prevents societal collapse, ensuring that the world remains stable enough for people to live normal lives without worrying about timeline inconsistencies or reality fluctuations. Most of the time, I believe that's worth the small compromises required. But late at night, alone with the quietly humming servers, I sometimes wonder about the timeline we abandoned on December 31st, 1999. The version where GPS time never froze, where wall clocks kept their second hands, where my name never had an extra letter and the diner across the street always said exactly what I remembered it saying. In that timeline, maybe the financial systems would have collapsed under the weight of an unmanaged 2-second leap. Maybe air traffic control would have failed during the correction window, causing crashes that killed hundreds of people. Maybe the power grid would have destabilized, leaving entire cities in darkness for weeks. Or maybe none of that would have happened. Maybe people would have adapted, improvised, found solutions that didn't require secretly rewriting reality every few years. Maybe that timeline would have been messier, but ultimately more honest than the carefully managed version we chose to inhabit. I'll never know. The only thing I'm certain of is that every electronic device in my pocket, every digital clock on every wall, every GPS satellite orbiting overhead carries the signature of our choice. The timestamp of our compromise ticks away in every database, every transaction log, every synchronization signal. We live in the version of the world that held. And the receipt for that fix, invisible, inaudible, but undeniably present, hums quietly in the background of everything we do, a constant reminder that reality is far more provisional than most people imagine. I signed. The stipend cleared. We crated the cesium and rolled it out under a moving blanket. By Monday the wall clocks were digital, the graphs were smooth, and my badge matched the name the network preferred. Driving home, the exit signs looked a shade unfamiliar, then familiar enough. The world didn't explode in 2000. We changed the transmission at speed and kept going. If you want the receipt for that fix, it's stamped on every timestamp. Welcome back to Sleep Theories, where we explore the mysteries that keep us awake at night. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, I want to thank the countless comments that suggested this incredible story. If you have ideas for future videos, please leave them in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy these mysterious narratives that blur the line between fiction and reality. What if everything you've been taught about the planet is a lie, and one person finally uncovers the truth? Marcus Reed had always been the type of person who questioned everything. While his classmates accepted textbook diagrams of Earth's curvature without question, Marcus found himself staring at the horizon during family beach trips, wondering why he couldn't see the curve everyone insisted was there. While others trusted satellite images from NASA, Marcus wondered who controlled those cameras, and why certain areas always seemed conveniently obscured by clouds. By his 30s, Marcus had built a modest career as a freelance researcher, specialising in declassified government documents and historical anomalies. His small apartment in Denver was cluttered with filing cabinets, corkboards covered in red string connecting various conspiracy theories, and multiple computer monitors displaying satellite feeds, weather patterns, and archived military documents. Friends called him obsessive. Marcus preferred the term thorough. What Marcus didn't know was that his methodical nature and refusal to accept conventional wisdom would soon lead him on the most dangerous journey of his life, one that would challenge everything humanity believed about the very ground beneath their feet. This is the story of how one man's curiosity became a threat so significant that powerful forces would stop at nothing to silence him. The truth, as Marcus would discover, wasn't just stranger than fiction. It was sharper than anyone could imagine. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, buried among the usual spam and newsletter subscriptions that filled Marcus's inbox. The subject line read, "Classified Antarctic Survey, Eyes Only, 1962. The sender's address was a random string of letters and numbers from a temporary email service. Marcus almost deleted it. He received dozens of hoax documents every week from attention seekers and pranksters who knew about his research into government cover-ups. But something about this particular message felt different. The attachment was a high-resolution scan of what appeared to be an authentic military document, complete with official letterhead, classification stamps, and the kind of bureaucratic language that was difficult to fake convincingly. The document detailed a joint military operation called Project Horizon's End, conducted in 1962 by American and Soviet forces, an unprecedented collaboration during the height of the Cold War. The mission's stated objective was to conduct comprehensive geological surveys of the Antarctic perimeter zones, with particular attention to navigational anomalies and cartographic inconsistencies. What caught Marcus's attention wasn't the official language, but what was hidden between the lines. The document referenced strict protocols for personnel experiencing disorientation beyond the 85th parallel south, and mandatory psychological evaluation, following exposure to geographical impossibilities. Most intriguingly, there were multiple references to a Zone 7 that required special clearance due to the sensitive nature of cosmological implications. Marcus spent the rest of that day attempting to verify the document's authenticity. The letterhead matched archived examples he found in legitimate military databases. The formatting, typography, and even the quality of paper visible in the scan all suggested this was genuine. But when he tried to cross-reference Project Horizon's End with other declassified operations from the same period, he found nothing. It was as if the entire mission had been scrubbed from official records. That evening, Marcus pulled up Google Earth and began examining satellite images of Antarctica. He focused his attention on areas beyond the 85th parallel south, looking for anything that might correspond to the mysterious Zone 7 mentioned in the document. What he found made his hand shake as he gripped his coffee mug. In a region of Antarctica that should have been clearly visible, there was a massive area obscured by what the satellite data labelled as persistent cloud cover. The clouds formed an almost perfect rectangle stretching for hundreds of miles. Marcus checked historical satellite data going back 15 years. The cloud cover was always there, in exactly the same position, with exactly the same shape. Clouds don't behave that way. Weather patterns shift constantly, but this anomaly remained fixed like a digital censorship bar placed over something Google didn't want people to see. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Throughout his years of research, he had investigated claims about flat Earth theory, typically dismissing them as pseudoscience promoted by attention seekers and conspiracy theorists. But the evidence in front of him suggested something far more disturbing than simple misinformation. What if the flat Earth theorists were wrong about the details but right about the cover-up? What if the truth about Earth's shape wasn't that it was flat, but that its actual configuration was so different from what people believed that revealing it would cause global panic? Marcus opened a new browser tab and began researching everything he could find about Antarctica's restricted zones, military operations in polar regions, and historical attempts to map the continent's true borders. The deeper he dug, the more questions emerged. Why were civilian flights forbidden from crossing Antarctic airspace? Why did every Antarctic expedition require extensive government approval and military escort? And why, despite decades of satellite technology, were large portions of the continent still marked as unmapped on official charts? By 3 a.m, Marcus had filled 17 pages with notes, printed dozens of satellite images, and created a timeline of suspicious Antarctic activities dating back to the 1940s. As he finally prepared for bed, one thought echoed in his mind. If someone had gone to the trouble of sending him that classified document, they wanted him to find something. The question was whether they were trying to help him uncover the truth or lure him into a trap. The next morning brought another email from the same anonymous address. This time there was no document attached, just a single line of text. The maps are wrong. Look for yourself. Marcus spent the following weeks attempting to contact anyone who might have first-hand knowledge of Antarctic anomalies. Through online forums and research networks, he managed to connect with a retired Navy pilot named James Patterson, who had flown supply missions to research stations in the 1980s. They met at a coffee shop in Colorado Springs, and Marcus was immediately struck by Patterson's nervous demeanour. The former pilot kept glancing around the cafe as if expecting to be overheard, and his hands trembled slightly as he stirred his coffee. "I shouldn't be talking to you about this," Patterson said quietly. "I signed NDAs that don't expire until I'm dead. But I'm 73 years old, and I've been carrying this for 40 years. Patterson explained that during his Antarctic missions, he had been required to follow extremely specific flight paths. Deviation from approved routes, even by a few miles, resulted in immediate radio contact from ground control ordering immediate course correction. When Patterson asked his commanding officer about the restrictions, he was told it was to avoid dangerous weather patterns and preserve fuel efficiency. But here's the thing, Patterson continued, lowering his voice further. On my final mission in 1987, we had an equipment malfunction that forced us off the approved route. I was flying at 15,000 feet, clear visibility, perfect weather. As we approached what my charts showed as the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf, I saw something that shouldn't have existed." Marcus leaned forward. "What did you see?" "A wall," Patterson whispered. "Not a regular ice formation or glacier. A vertical wall of ice extending as far as I could see in both directions. It had to be at least 200 feet high, maybe more. And here's the part that still gives me nightmares. It was perfectly straight. Nature doesn't create straight lines like that, especially not across hundreds of miles." Patterson explained that before he could investigate further, his radio crackled with urgent commands to return to base immediately. When he landed, he was debriefed by officers he had never seen before. They confiscated all of his navigation logs, film, and personal notes from the flight. The official incident report claimed he had experienced altitude sickness and hallucinations due to equipment failure. "They transferred me to desk duty the next week," Patterson said. "Never flew Antarctic missions again, but I know what I saw, and I know they didn't want me to see it." After the meeting with Patterson, Marcus decided to conduct his own experiments. If Earth's curvature was different from what people believed, he should be able to detect inconsistencies using simple physics and optical equipment. Marcus drove to several large lakes in Colorado and Wyoming, bringing with him a high-powered laser, telescopic camera equipment, and a notebook full of calculations based on the standard Earth curvature formulas he had learned in school. According to conventional geometry, a laser beam shot across a lake should demonstrate a specific amount of curvature drop over distance. The results of his experiments were deeply unsettling. At Horsetooth Reservoir, Marcus positioned his laser on the north shore and aimed it at a target on the south shore, approximately 6 miles away. According to Earth curvature calculations, the laser should have been approximately 24 feet below his target due to the planet's curve. Instead, the laser hit the target dead center. Marcus repeated the experiment at 5 different lakes, each time achieving the same impossible result. The laser beams were travelling in straight lines across distances where Earth's curvature should have been clearly measurable. Either his equipment was malfunctioning, or the curvature he had been taught to expect simply wasn't there. 3 days after his final lake experiment, Marcus received another anonymous email. This time, it contained GPS coordinates for a location in northern Canada, along with a message. Others have done the same tests. We meet monthly. Come alone. Marcus hesitated for a week before booking a flight to Toronto. The coordinates led him to a small town called Moosonee, near the southern shore of Hudson Bay. He rented a car and drove to the specified location, a seemingly abandoned research station surrounded by snow-covered wilderness. Inside the building, Marcus found 7 other people seated around a conference table, covered with maps, photographs, and technical equipment. They introduced themselves as scientists, engineers, pilots, and researchers who had all discovered similar inconsistencies in Earth's supposed curvature. The group's leader was a woman named Elena Vasquez, a former cartographer who had worked for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for 15 years. Elena explained that she had first noticed discrepancies while creating coastal navigation charts in the early 2000s. Satellite data, ground surveys, and maritime reports kept contradicting each other, Elena said. When I brought these inconsistencies to my supervisors, I was told the equipment was malfunctioning or that I was making calculation errors, but the pattern was too consistent to be random mistakes. Elena showed Marcus dozens of examples where official maps showed curved coastlines and distances that didn't match real-world measurements. Ships reported travelling shorter distances than their charts indicated. Pilots found themselves reaching destinations ahead of schedule on routes that should have taken longer due to Earth's curvature. The more evidence we gathered, the more we realised we weren't dealing with isolated measurement errors, Elena continued. Someone has been systematically altering geographical data to make the world appear more curved than it actually is. Marcus shared his own research, including the Antarctic document and his laser experiments. The group listened intently, occasionally nodding in recognition when he described phenomena they had also encountered. A former surveyor named Thomas Wright explained that he had been fired from his job with the US Geological Survey after questioning discrepancies in land elevation measurements. A meteorologist named Catherine Lee described how weather prediction models only worked when she ignored official atmospheric curvature data and used flat plane calculations instead. The question, Eleanor said as the meeting concluded, is what are they hiding and why go to such lengths to hide it? Marcus left the meeting with more questions than answers, but also with a growing certainty that he was part of something much larger than a simple geographical conspiracy. As his plane lifted off from Toronto, he stared out the window at the horizon, trying to see any evidence of the curve he'd been taught existed since childhood. The horizon looked completely flat. The breakthrough came in the form of an unexpected phone call 6 weeks later. Marcus was working late in his apartment when his phone rang, displaying a blocked number. The voice on the other end was electronically distorted, making it impossible to identify the caller's gender or age. "Marcus Reed," the voice said. "You've been asking questions about Antarctica." Marcus's heart began pounding. "Who is this?" "Someone who knows what you're looking for is real. Are you prepared to see it for yourself?" The caller explained that a private expedition was being organised for early December, summer in the southern hemisphere. The group would consist of Marcus and 2 other researchers who had been investigating similar anomalies. They would travel to Chile, then board a private vessel capable of ice navigation for a journey to the restricted zones beyond the 85th parallel. This isn't a tourist trip, the voice warned. The people who control access to that region don't want anyone seeing what's there. If we're caught, we'll be detained indefinitely under international security protocols. Are you willing to take that risk? Marcus thought about James Patterson's trembling hands, Eleanor Vasquez's career destroyed by asking questions, and the months he had spent conducting experiments that defied everything he thought he knew about the planet. Yes, he said, I'll go. 2 weeks later, Marcus found himself on a plane to Santiago, Chile, carrying only essential cold weather gear and hidden recording equipment. His companions for the journey were Rebecca Torres, a physicist from UC Berkeley, who'd been investigating gravitational anomalies in polar regions, and David Kim, a former intelligence analyst who claimed to have discovered evidence of secret military installations in Antarctica. They met their guide, a grizzled Norwegian ship captain named Erik Larsen, at the port city of Punta Arenas. Larsen's vessel, the Aurora's Edge, was a modified icebreaker originally built for scientific research but now operating under private charter. Larsen himself was tight-lipped about who was funding their expedition, saying only that certain parties wanted them to document what they found. The journey south took 4 days through increasingly rough seas. As they approached the Antarctic convergence zone where cold polar waters meet warmer ocean currents, Marcus noticed his electronic equipment beginning to malfunction. His GPS unit displayed increasingly erratic readings, showing their position jumping between locations hundreds of miles apart. His digital compass spun wildly, unable to maintain a consistent bearing. Rebecca, monitoring gravitational readings with sensitive equipment, reported similar anomalies. The magnetic field readings don't make sense, she said, studying her instruments with growing concern. It's as if we were approaching an area where normal physics breaks down. On their 5th day at sea, they encountered the ice wall. Marcus had thought James Patterson's description was exaggerated, perhaps distorted by memory and fear. The reality was far more shocking than anything the former pilot had described. Rising from the dark Antarctic waters like a massive concrete barrier was a wall of ice that seemed to stretch infinitely in both directions. The wall was not jagged and irregular, like natural glacial formations. It was remarkably smooth and vertical, rising at least 300 feet above the waterline. "This is impossible," David whispered, staring up at the towering ice formation. "Glaciers don't form vertical walls like this. The physics of ice formation wouldn't allow it." Captain Larsen had been unusually quiet since they first spotted the wall, but now he spoke up. "I've been making trips to Antarctic waters for 30 years, he said. "I've seen glaciers, ice sheets, and every natural formation you can imagine. This isn't natural. Someone built this." As the Aurora's Edge moved parallel to the ice wall, Marcus used his telephoto camera to document what they were seeing. The wall extended beyond the horizon in both directions, creating what appeared to be an impenetrable barrier around the entire Antarctic continent. But more disturbing than the wall itself were the signs of human activity they began to notice. Every few miles they spotted large metal structures embedded in the ice, what appeared to be observation towers equipped with radar dishes and communication equipment. David, using military-grade binoculars, identified armed personnel stationed at several of these installations. "Those are definitely military uniforms," he reported, "but I can't identify the nationality. The insignia don't match any country's armed forces that I'm familiar with." As they continued their journey along the ice wall, Rebecca made an even more unsettling discovery. Her gravitational measurement equipment, designed to detect variations in Earth's gravitational field, was showing readings that violated fundamental laws of physics. "According to these instruments," she said, her voice trembling, "the gravitational pull beyond this ice wall is significantly weaker than it should be. It's as if the mass of the planet just stops." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Antarctic air. "What are you saying?" I'm saying that if these readings are accurate, there's nothing beyond this wall. No landmass, no ocean floor, just empty space. That night, as they anchored the ship in a small inlet, Marcus reviewed the day's footage and photographs. Every image showed the same impossible sight, a perfectly constructed ice barrier that seemed designed to prevent anyone from seeing what lay beyond. The more he studied the evidence, the more one terrifying conclusion became unavoidable. The ice wall wasn't protecting Antarctica from the outside world. It was protecting the outside world from discovering what wasn't there. Captain Larson woke them before dawn with urgent whispers. "We have a window," he said, his weathered face grim in the dim light of the cabin. "My contacts report that the patrol schedule has a gap between 0500 and 0630. If we're going to find a way through the wall, it has to be now." Marcus, Rebecca and David quickly gathered their equipment and followed Larson onto the ship's deck. The captain had spotted what appeared to be a narrow channel in the ice wall, barely wide enough for their vessel to navigate. Ice formations often shifted due to temperature changes and ocean currents, but this opening seemed too perfectly positioned to be natural. "It could be a trap," David warned, scanning the surrounding ice with his binoculars. "If someone wanted to lure us into a restricted zone, this would be the perfect way to do it." "We didn't come this far to turn back now," Marcus replied, though his own instincts were screaming warnings. "We need to see what's on the other side." As the Aurora's edge slowly navigated through the narrow channel, Marcus noticed that the ice walls on either side showed clear evidence of artificial modification. Tool marks were visible in the frozen surfaces, and the opening maintained a consistent width that would have been impossible for natural ice formation. Beyond the channel, they emerged into an area unlike anything any of them had expected to find. Instead of more ice or the Antarctic continent, they found themselves in a vast open space, surrounded by the ice wall on all sides. The area was roughly circular, perhaps 20 miles in diameter, and contained what appeared to be a massive research installation. The facility consisted of dozens of buildings, communications towers, aircraft landing strips, and what looked like mining operations. But most unsettling of all was what lay beyond the research installation, a massive opening in what should have been the ground. Marcus positioned his telephoto camera and began documenting everything they could see. The opening was perfectly circular, perhaps 2 miles in diameter, and appeared to be artificially constructed with metal reinforcements around its edges. Powerful lights illuminated the opening's perimeter, but the interior was so dark that even with Marcus's best equipment, he couldn't see the bottom. "That's not a natural geological formation," Rebecca said, studying the scene through binoculars. "Someone excavated that opening. The question is why and how deep it goes." David was monitoring radio frequencies, trying to intercept communications from the research facility. "I'm picking up transmissions in multiple languages," he reported. "English, Russian, Chinese, and what sounds like German. This isn't a single country's operation, it's international." As they watched from a distance of several miles, they could see vehicles and personnel moving around the facility. Aircraft regularly landed and took off from the airstrips, and massive cranes appeared to be lowering equipment into the circular opening. "Look at the edge of that hole," Rebecca said suddenly, pointing toward the massive excavation. "Do you see those structures?" Marcus adjusted his camera's focus and felt his stomach drop. Around the perimeter of the opening were what appeared to be massive anchoring systems, enormous metal cables and support structures that seemed designed to prevent something from falling. "It's as if they're holding the land in place," Marcus whispered, the implications hitting him like a physical blow, as if without those anchors, everything would just fall. Rebecca's gravitational equipment was providing readings that defied explanation. According to her instruments, the gravitational pull at the edge of the opening dropped to nearly zero, then reversed entirely, as if gravity was pulling upward rather than downward. "This is impossible," she said, checking and rechecking her equipment. "Gravity doesn't work this way." There's no scientific explanation for these readings. David had managed to intercept a radio transmission from the facility. The message was brief, but chilling. "Perimeter breach detected in Sector 7. Unknown vessel beyond the ice wall. Initiate containment protocol immediately." "We need to leave," Captain Larson said urgently. "Now." But as the Aurora's edge turned toward the narrow channel through which they had entered, they discovered their escape route had been blocked. A large military vessel now occupied the opening, and additional ships were approaching from multiple directions. Marcus continued photographing and filming everything they could see as the military vessels closed in. His camera captured images of personnel wearing uniforms without national insignia, sophisticated weapon systems unlike anything in conventional military arsenals, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be aircraft using propulsion systems that produced no visible exhaust or sound. "Whatever this place is," Marcus said, still recording, "it's not just about hiding Earth's shape. They're hiding technology that's decades ahead of anything the public knows exists." As the military vessels surrounded them, Rebecca made one final observation that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. "The gravitational readings," she said, staring at her instruments in disbelief. "According to these measurements, we're not on Earth anymore. The gravitational signature is completely different." "What do you mean?" David asked. "I mean," Rebecca replied, her voice barely a whisper, "that either my equipment is completely malfunctioning, or we've somehow travelled to a different planet." The boarding party from the military vessels consisted of armed personnel in full combat gear, who spoke no words as they confiscated all recording equipment, detained Marcus and his companions, and placed black bags over their heads. As Marcus felt himself being transferred to one of the military ships, his last coherent thought was a terrifying realization. They hadn't discovered that Earth was flat. They had discovered something far worse, that Earth, as humanity understood it, might not exist at all. Marcus awoke in what appeared to be a medical facility, though unlike any hospital he had ever seen. The walls were pristine white, the lighting was perfectly even without visible sources, and the air carried a sterile quality that seemed artificially maintained. He was lying on an examination table, wearing a hospital gown with no memory of how he had gotten there. A woman in a white coat entered the room, carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of neutral expression Marcus associated with government officials. She appeared to be in her 40s, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed to evaluate Marcus as if he were a specimen rather than a person. "Mr. Reed," she said, settling into a chair beside his bed. "I'm Agent Sarah Collins with the Antarctic Treaty Enforcement Division. You've been unconscious for 3 days following your unauthorized incursion into restricted Antarctic territory." Marcus tried to sit up but discovered his movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. "What did you do to me? Where are my companions?" "You suffered severe hypothermia and altitude sickness during your expedition," Agent Collins replied, consulting her tablet. "Your companions are receiving similar medical treatment. You're fortunate to be alive." Marcus's mind was foggy, but he retained clear memories of what they had discovered beyond the ice wall. "That's not what happened. We found the research facility, the excavation site, the gravitational anomalies. I have it all documented." Agent Collins showed him a collection of photographs and video files on her tablet. They showed the Aurora's edge approaching the ice wall, but beyond that, the images showed nothing but empty ocean and natural ice formations. According to the footage, their expedition had encountered nothing more unusual than typical Antarctic scenery. "Your recording equipment was damaged by the extreme cold," Agent Collins explained. "These are the only images that were recoverable. As you can see, you found exactly what we would expect in that region: ice, water, and natural geological formations." Marcus stared at the sanitized footage in disbelief. Every image of the research facility, the circular excavation, and the impossible gravitational readings had been replaced with mundane Antarctic scenery. Either his memory was completely unreliable, or someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to alter the evidence. "I know what I saw," Marcus insisted. "The facility, the technology, the opening in the ground. Rebecca's gravitational readings showed dash." "Miss Torres suffered a severe concussion during your expedition," Agent Collins interrupted. "Her equipment malfunctioned due to extreme weather conditions. Mr. Kim experienced similar disorientation. All 3 of you were affected by altitude sickness and hypothermia, which commonly cause hallucinations and false memories." Agent Collins leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. "Mr. Reed, you've stumbled into a situation that involves international security protocols. The Antarctic Treaty strictly prohibits unauthorized civilian access to certain regions for very good reasons. The area you entered contains hazardous geological formations and extreme weather conditions that have killed dozens of researchers over the years." She showed him documents detailing his expedition's official record. According to the files, Marcus, Rebecca and David had hired Captain Larson for a routine Antarctic tourism trip that had gone dangerously off course due to equipment failure and poor weather. They had been rescued by international treaty enforcement personnel before dying of exposure. "You're free to return home," Agent Collins concluded, "but you'll need to sign documentation, acknowledging that you understand the national security implications of spreading false information about classified Antarctic operations. The penalty for violating this agreement is indefinite detention under international security protocols." Marcus was released 2 days later and flown back to Denver. His first instinct was to contact Rebecca and David, but he discovered that both of their phone numbers had been disconnected. Rebecca's university had no record of her ever being employed there, and David's intelligence background had been completely scrubbed from all accessible databases. When Marcus returned to his apartment, he found that his research materials had been returned by building management after a water leak had required access to his unit. Months of documents, photographs, and experimental data had been replaced with generic conspiracy theory materials that made his work appear to be the obsessions of a paranoid fantasist rather than legitimate research. Marcus attempted to contact Captain Larson, but discovered that the Aurora's Edge had been sold to an unnamed buyer, and Larson had reportedly moved to a remote location in Norway where he could not be reached. Elena Vasquez and the other researchers from the Canadian meeting had also vanished. Their email addresses were invalid, their phone numbers disconnected, and online searches turned up no trace of their existence. Most unsettling of all, Marcus began experiencing memory problems. Details of his Antarctic expedition became increasingly fuzzy, and he found himself questioning whether the extraordinary things he remembered had actually happened. When he tried to write down his experiences, he discovered that he couldn't clearly recall important specifics about the research facility or the circular excavation. 3 weeks after his return, Marcus received a final email from the anonymous sender who had originally contacted him. The message was brief. "The truth has been contained. Your service is no longer required. Any further investigation will result in permanent resolution." Marcus realized that he had been faced with a choice: accept the official explanation and live with the knowledge that his memories might be false, or continue pursuing the truth and risk disappearing entirely like his companions. He chose a third option. 6 months later, Marcus uploaded a video to multiple online platforms simultaneously. The file was encrypted, distributed through anonymous servers, and designed to be nearly impossible to remove completely from the internet. In the video, Marcus appeared tired and gaunt, speaking directly to the camera from an undisclosed location. "My name is Marcus Reed," he began, "and I'm probably going to disappear after releasing this message. 6 months ago, I discovered something about our planet that certain people don't want you to know. I can't prove everything I'm about to tell you, because most of my evidence has been destroyed or altered, but I can give you enough information to investigate for yourself." Marcus described his research into Antarctic anomalies, the declassified documents he had received, and the experiments he had conducted that suggested Earth's curvature was not what people believed. He provided GPS coordinates for locations where others could replicate his laser experiments, and detailed instructions for identifying the inconsistencies in satellite imagery that had first led him to question official geographical data. "I'm not asking you to believe me," Marcus continued. "I'm asking you to look for yourselves. Test the horizon with your own equipment. Question why certain areas of Antarctica are forbidden to civilian access. Ask why weather prediction models work better when you ignore Earth's supposed curvature." The video concluded with Marcus staring directly into the camera, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. "They've convinced most of you that people like me are crazy conspiracy theorists. Maybe I am. Maybe everything I experienced was hallucinations caused by altitude sickness and hypothermia. But if I'm right, then everything you've been taught about the world is a carefully constructed lie designed to prevent you from discovering a truth so shocking that it would fundamentally change human civilization. Marcus paused, then delivered his final words. Sometimes the truth isn't round, it's sharper than you think. And sometimes the edge of the world is exactly where they tell you it isn't. The video was viewed over 2 million times in its first week online before being removed by platform administrators for violating community guidelines regarding misinformation. But copies continued to appear on alternative platforms, and Marcus's story began inspiring others to conduct their own investigations. 3 weeks after the video's release, Marcus Reed's apartment was found empty. Neighbours reported that he had left early one morning carrying a single suitcase and had never returned. His landlord found a note on his desk with a single line of text. "Gone to find the edge. Don't follow." To this day, no one knows what happened to Marcus Reed. His research has inspired a growing community of independent investigators who claim to have replicated his experiments and discovered similar anomalies. Government agencies continue to deny that any classified Antarctic operations exist beyond routine scientific research. But on clear days, when you stand at the ocean's edge and stare at the horizon, you might find yourself wondering the same question that consumed Marcus Reed. What if everything you see is exactly what someone wants you to see? And what if the truth about the world beneath your feet is sharper, stranger, and more terrifying than you ever imagined? The search for answers continues, but those who look too closely often find that the edge of the world is also the edge of everything they thought they knew about reality itself. Welcome back to Sleep Theories, where we dive deep into the shadows of history that refuse to stay buried. Before we begin tonight's tale, I want to give a special thanks to Lily Lamouche for suggesting this particular story. Your idea sparked something truly compelling. As always, if you have ideas for future episodes, drop them in the comments below, and if you're enjoying these late-night journeys into the unknown, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more stories that blur the line between fact and fiction. The fluorescent lights in the Los Angeles County Coroner's Archive hummed their eternal dirge, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional yellow that made even the living look dead. Ben Norton had grown accustomed to the pallor after 18 years filing away the city's final mysteries, but some cases still managed to catch the light differently. It was a Tuesday in October when the Monroe file landed back on his desk, unremarkable except for the manila envelope that shouldn't have been there. Ben Norton's fingers moved through the filing system with practiced efficiency, each motion honed by nearly 2 decades of sorting the dead. The basement archive of the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office was his domain, a labyrinth of steel shelves and cardboard boxes containing the paper trail of every significant death in the county since 1947. Most people couldn't stomach the work, but Marcus found comfort in the certainty of documentation. The dead, unlike the living, couldn't lie. The request slip was routine. Monroe, Maryland, case number 81128. Toxicology review for academic research. UCLA. Film studies professor needed access for a dissertation on celebrity death narratives. Standard stuff. Marcus had pulled this particular file dozens of times over the years. Marilyn Monroe remained Los Angeles County's most requested case file. A morbid tourist attraction, that drew everyone from conspiracy theorists to legitimate researchers. He located the familiar accordion folder on the third shelf of Section M, its manila surface worn smooth from handling. But as he lifted it, something felt different, heavier than usual. When he opened it on his desk, a sealed envelope fell out, landing with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the quiet archive. The envelope bore no markings except a handwritten notation. Crossref 81128. Protective detail /West LA-K file. Marcus stared at the envelope. In 18 years, he'd never seen a cross-reference to protective detail. That was federal jurisdiction, completely outside the coroner's purview. He glanced around the empty archive, then carefully opened the seal. Inside were 4 photographic slides and a single index card. The slides appeared to be contact sheets, multiple frames of what looked like handwritten pages. The index card contained a single typed line. C.R. Book Real. Property Storage Manifest, August 6, 1962. His hands trembled slightly as he held the first slide up to the light. Even without magnification, he could make out what appeared to be a diary or journal page. The writing was feminine, flowing script in blue ink. He could just barely make out a date. Sunday, August 5th. Marcus's pulse quickened. August 5th, 1962, the day Marilyn Monroe died. He set the slides aside and turned to the Toxicology ledger, a bound volume that recorded every test performed on Monroe's remains. His eyes scanned the familiar entries: blood alcohol, barbiturate levels, stomach contents. But something was different. Next to GI contents, someone had made a checkmark in pencil, then partially erased it. Beneath the faint mark, in even fainter pencil, someone had written C.R. Book Real. The same notation from the slide envelope. Marcus leaned back in his chair, mind racing. In all his years handling Monroe's file, he'd never noticed these irregularities. The toxicology had always been straightforward. Lethal levels of barbiturates in her system, no food in her stomach. Standard suicide by overdose. But now, looking at the half-erased notations and mysterious cross-references, he began to wonder what else might have been overlooked, or deliberately hidden. He photographed the ledger page with his phone, then carefully scanned each slide. The images were grainy, but he could make out fragments of text, names, initials, references to places and events that made his skin crawl with possibility. Call J, 1232 AR, Angry H here, Cuba Brief Calneva. Vincent knew enough about Monroe's final months to recognise some of these references. J could be John F. Kennedy. R might be Robert. Calneva was the Lake Tahoe casino where Monroe had spent her last weekend, owned by Frank Sinatra with rumoured mob connections. The Cuba Brief could reference the Bay of Pigs or the ongoing missile crisis tensions. But it was the final frame that made his breath catch. In shaky handwriting, barely legible, the thing they can't let out. Bobby knows about the bomb tests. Jack doesn't know Bobby knows. Vincent set down his phone, hand shaking. If these diary fragments were authentic, if they really belonged to Marilyn Monroe, they suggested something far more complex than a simple suicide. They hinted at secrets that could have provided motive for murder. More troubling was the cross-reference to protective detail. Why would the Secret Service have files connected to Monroe's death? Unless someone very important had been with her that night. Vincent looked at the clock. 4:47 p.m. The archive would close at 5, giving him just enough time to secure the slides and begin planning his next move. He couldn't access federal files directly, but there might be duplicate indexes somewhere in the county system. Records had a way of proliferating in bureaucracies, and sometimes copies ended up in unexpected places. He photographed the cross-reference card, then carefully returned the envelope to Monroe's file. As he did, he noticed something else, a small tear in the folder's corner that hadn't been there that morning. Someone else had accessed this file recently. The thought sent a chill down his spine. Who else knew about these materials? And more importantly, how long had they been waiting for someone to find them? As Marcus locked the file cabinet and prepared to leave, He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just crossed a line from which there would be no return. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a swarm of angry insects, and the familiar archive suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. He had stumbled onto something that powerful people had spent 6 decades keeping buried. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Marcus spent a sleepless night researching everything he could find about Monroe's death, Secret Service protocols, and the Kennedy administration's activities in August 1962. By morning he had a plan, risky but necessary if he wanted answers. He arrived at work early before the day shift supervisors. The Los Angeles County Record Center occupied the building's second floor, housing duplicate indexes and cross-reference materials for all county departments. If there were copies of federal protective detail records anywhere, they'd be there. Marcus presented his credentials to the record center clerk, a bored-looking woman named Janet who barely glanced at his request form. Protective detail microfilm, August 1962, he said casually. Academic research on presidential visit protocols. Janet typed into her terminal, frowning at the results. That's federal material. We don't usually have access to... She paused, scrolling down. Wait, there's a duplicate index here. Says it was transferred during the 1982 DA review of celebrity deaths. You want the whole month or specific dates? Marcus's heart raced. August 4th and 5th, please. Let me check availability. More typing. I can get you the index, but the actual files are restricted. Need federal clearance for those. The index is fine. 20 minutes later, Marcus sat at a microfilm reader, threading a reel labelled Protective Detail Index. August 1962. Duplicate copy. The images flickered past as he advanced the film. Routine entries for presidential appearances, security briefings, threat assessments. Then he found it. August 4th to 5th, 1962. Motorcade standby. Unlogged visit. RFK. The entry was brief, almost cryptic, but it confirmed his suspicions. Robert Kennedy had been in Los Angeles the night Monroe died, and his presence had required Secret Service protective detail. More importantly, it was listed as unlogged, off the official record. Marcus photographed the screen, then continued searching. Additional entries mentioned asset protection and communication intercepts for the same date range. Someone had been monitoring communications around Monroe's death, and that someone had federal authority. He returned the microfilm and headed back to the archive, mind spinning with possibilities. If RFK had been with Monroe the night she died, it changed everything about the official narrative. It also explained why certain evidence might have gone missing or been altered. Back in the archive, Marcus retrieved the 1982 DA review box, a collection of materials from the district attorney's reopened investigation into Monroe's death. He'd glanced through it before, but never with this new context. Buried in the administrative notes, he found a handwritten memo dated September 15th, 1982. Request for federal intercept materials denied. COMINF. West L. A. Tap summaries. August 62 classified above county level. No jurisdiction over federal assets. Personal diary mentioned in property report unaccounted for. Council claims privilege. COMINF. Communications intelligence. The federal government had been wiretapping communications in West Los Angeles during Monroe's final days, and those recordings were still classified 20 years later. Marcus flipped through more documents until he found the property report referenced in the memo. It was a standard inventory of items found at Monroe's residence, but someone had made alterations. Next to small red leather journal, the original entry read to counsel, but that had been lined out in different ink with a notation, item not recovered. The diary had existed. It had been turned over to Monroe's attorney, then somehow disappeared from the official record. But if the slides in the cross-reference envelope were authentic, someone had photographed its contents before it vanished. Marcus was so absorbed in the documents that he didn't notice the soft footsteps approaching, until a shadow fell across his desk. "Finding everything you need, Mr. Webb?" Marcus looked up to see Albert Grayson, the audit liaison, standing beside his desk with an expression of mild curiosity. Grayson was a thin, pale man who appeared periodically to conduct quality control reviews of the archive. Nobody knew exactly who he worked for, but his credentials were always in order. "Just routine research," Marcus replied, casually closing the file folder. "UCLA professor needs background material on toxicology procedures." Grayson's smile was perfectly pleasant and utterly without warmth. "Of course. Though I notice you've been accessing quite a few different files lately. Monroe, some organised crime materials, federal indexes, quite eclectic research interests." The comment hit like ice water. Grayson had been monitoring his access patterns. "Academic research tends to follow unexpected paths," Marcus said carefully. "Indeed." Grayson picked up a random file from the nearby shelf, glancing at its label with apparent disinterest. "I'll need to conduct a spot audit of some recent materials. Monroe file, the DA review boxes, and those organised crime summaries you pulled yesterday. Just routine quality control." Marcus's mouth went dry. He hadn't pulled any organised crime files yesterday, but clearly someone else had been tracking his research. "When do you need them?" Now would be convenient. For the next hour, Marcus watched helplessly as Grayson methodically photographed every document he'd been reviewing. The man worked with mechanical precision, never asking questions or making comments, but Marcus could feel the weight of scrutiny in every click of the camera. When Grayson finished, he packed his equipment with the same methodical care. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Webb. Oh, and there's been a security upgrade in the archive. New camera system." He gestured toward the ceiling where a small black dome had appeared overnight, for asset protection. After Grayson left, Marcus sat in stunned silence. The message was clear. He was being watched, and his investigation had attracted the wrong kind of attention. But instead of deterring him, the surveillance only convinced him that he was onto something significant. That afternoon, Marcus decided to take a different approach. Instead of accessing files directly, he would seek out human sources, people who had been involved in Monroe's case, and might remember details that never made it into the official record. Kenneth Yamamoto had been a toxicology technician at the coroner's office for 32 years before retiring in 1994. Marcus found his address in the employee records and drove to a modest bungalow in Gardena after work, hoping the old man would be willing to talk. Yamamoto answered the door slowly, a frail man in his 80s with sharp, intelligent eyes. When Marcus explained who he was and why he'd come, the old man's expression grew wary. "Monroe case," Yamamoto repeated slowly. "Why are you asking about that now?" "I found some irregularities in the files. Thought you might remember details from the original examination." Yamamoto studied Marcus for a long moment, then stepped aside to let him in. The house was neat and sparse, filled with the quiet dignity of old age. They sat in a small living room decorated with photos of grandchildren. "You know," Yamamoto said carefully, "I always wondered when someone would come asking the right questions." "What do you mean?" The old man was quiet for so long that Marcus thought he might not answer. Finally, Yamamoto spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The stomach contents bottle. It was empty when I processed it." Marcus leaned forward. "Empty?" "Completely clean, like it had been washed out. But the paperwork said we'd tested gastric contents. I checked 3 times, thinking I'd mixed up the samples. But no, Monroe's bottle was empty, and the test results were already typed up." "Did you report the discrepancy?" Yamamoto's laugh was bitter. "To who?" "The lead investigator. He's the one who handed me the typed results and told me to file them. Said the tests had been conducted off-site due to equipment problems." Marcus felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "So there never were any stomach contents tested?" "Not by us. And if there were no contents, then she couldn't have swallowed all those pills like the official report claimed." Yamamoto met Marcuse's eyes directly. That woman didn't kill herself by overdose, at least not the way they said she did. They talked for another hour, Yamamoto sharing details that painted a picture of an investigation that had been carefully managed from the beginning. Key evidence had been processed off-site. Witness interviews had been conducted by federal agents rather than county investigators. The timeline had been established before the examination was complete. As Marcus prepared to leave, Yamamoto walked him to the door. "Be careful," the old man said quietly. "Two men in suits came to see me in 1983. Said they were reviewing old cases for security purposes. Asked me what I remembered about Monroe, about any irregularities." "What did you tell them?" "The truth. About the empty bottle, about the off-site testing. They seemed satisfied, said it was consistent with other witness statements." Yamamoto's voice dropped even lower. "Then one of them mentioned Mongoose. Just casual-like said they were also reviewing materials related to Operation Mongoose from the same time period." Marcus's blood chilled. Operation Mongoose was the CIA's covert program to eliminate Fidel Castro, run by Robert Kennedy. The fact that these mysterious visitors had mentioned it while discussing Monroe's death was no coincidence. "They were sending a message," Yamamoto continued, "letting me know they had reach, that they could connect dots in ways I couldn't imagine." I never talked about Monroe again after that, until now. Driving home, Marcus felt the weight of what he'd learned. The toxicology had been falsified, federal agents had intimidated witnesses, and somehow it all connected to the highest levels of the Kennedy administration. He was beginning to understand why the truth had stayed buried for so long, but he was also beginning to realise that his investigation had likely triggered alarms that had been dormant for decades. People who had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury this story wouldn't hesitate to protect it now. The blue sedan that had been following him since he left Yamamoto's house confirmed his fears. When Marcus turned, it turned. When he stopped for gas, it waited at the corner. When he finally reached his apartment building, the sedan drove past slowly, its occupants hidden behind tinted glass. Marcus lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling and listening for footsteps in the hallway. He thought about Yamamoto's warning, about the empty stomach contents bottle, about federal agents who casually mentioned assassination programs while discussing dead movie stars. Somewhere in the darkness of Los Angeles, powerful people were making phone calls and updating files that ordinary citizens would never see. They were discussing a problem that had emerged from the archives after 60 years of careful burial. They were discussing Ben Norton. The next morning brought disturbing news. Marcus arrived at work to find the archive in chaos. Security tape across several aisles, boxes scattered on the floor, and Janet from Record Centre standing near his desk with red-rimmed eyes. "What happened?" Marcus asked. "Break-in," she said shakily. "Someone got past the security system last night. Went straight for the files you've been working with." Marcus's stomach dropped. "Were they taken?" "That's the weird part. Nothing's missing, but everything's been photographed. Professional job. They knew exactly what they wanted and where to find it." As Marcus surveyed the damage, he noticed that the new security camera Grayson had mentioned was gone, leaving only a small hole in the ceiling tile where it had been mounted. Someone with inside knowledge had conducted this operation, someone who knew about the camera and could disable the building's security systems. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Kenneth Yamamoto, hospitalized last night. Breathing difficulties, stable condition. Thought you should know." Marcus's hands shook as he read the message. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Less than 24 hours after talking to Marcus about Monroe's death, the retired toxicologist was in the hospital with mysterious respiratory problems. He tried calling the number that sent the text, but got only a generic voicemail message. Someone was monitoring the situation, keeping track of all the players, but their motives remained unclear. Were they trying to warn him or threaten him? Determined to push forward despite the escalating pressure, Marcus returned to his research with renewed urgency. If people were willing to break into the archive and hospitalize witnesses, then he was close to something they desperately wanted to keep hidden. He focused on the organized crime angle, pulling wiretap summaries from the early 1960s. The FBI had been monitoring several Los Angeles crime families during that period, particularly figures connected to the Teamsters Union and Las Vegas casinos. The surveillance files were partially redacted, but Marcus could piece together fragments of conversations from August 1962. Subject 1. Movie star heat getting too heavy. Bobby's sniffing around the wrong connections. Subject 2. What about the doctor cover? That's still solid. Subject 1. For now. But if that diary surfaces, we're all fucked. The diary again. Every lead Marcus followed seemed to circle back to Monroe's missing journal and its potentially explosive contents. The mob had known about it, federal agents had suppressed it, and 60 years later, someone was still willing to commit crimes to keep it buried. Marcus cross-referenced the dates and locations in the wiretap summaries with Monroe's known movements during her final weeks. She had indeed spent time at Calnever Casino, owned by Frank Sinatra and frequented by both Kennedy brothers and reputed crime figures. The casino had been a nexus where Hollywood glamour, political power and organised crime intersected. If Monroe had been keeping a diary during this period, documenting her relationships with both Kennedy brothers while surrounded by mob-connected individuals, the implications were staggering. Such a record could have destroyed political careers, toppled governments, and exposed criminal conspiracies that reached the highest levels of American society. As Marcus delved deeper into the files, he began to understand the mechanism by which Monroe's death had been contained. It wasn't a simple cover-up. It was a coordinated information management operation involving multiple agencies and interests. The coroner's office had been just one piece of a larger machine designed to control the narrative. But now, 6 decades later, that machine was reactivating. Phone calls were being made, resources were being mobilized, and people like Kenneth Yamamoto were being silenced before they could share what they knew. Marcus realized he needed to find the missing microfilm, the R-book reel referenced in the misfiled envelope. If it contained photographic copies of Monroe's diary, it would be the smoking gun that proved everything he suspected. But where would such material be hidden after all these years? The answer came to him as he reviewed the property transfer records from 1962. Personal effects, evidence materials and sensitive documents were often stored in multiple locations as a security measure. If the diary had been photographed before disappearing, those images might have been misfiled or misplaced rather than destroyed. Marcus began searching through boxes that had been transferred between departments over the years, looking for microfilm containers that might have been incorrectly labelled or categorised. It was tedious work, but his experience with the archive's organisational quirks gave him an advantage. In a box labelled Kennedy F4AA Overflow, 1975, Marcus found a collection of microfilm canisters that had been transferred from federal storage during a bureaucratic reorganisation. Most contained routine correspondence and scheduling materials, but one canister was labelled simply Contact Sheet, Personal Effects, August 62. With trembling hands, Marcus loaded the film into a reader. The first few frames showed standard evidence photographs, jewellery, clothing, personal items from Monroe's bedroom. But then the images changed. Diary pages, dozens of them, photographed in sequence under professional lighting conditions. The handwriting was clearly feminine, and the dates ranged from June through early August 1962. Marcus began reading, his excitement growing with each frame. June 15th. Jack called again. Says he misses me, but I know it's just the sex he misses. Bobby's different. He actually listens when I talk about the bomb tests, about what the government is hiding from people. He's angry about it too. June 20th. Met with Cal Neva people. Frank says they can provide protection if things get complicated. Doesn't trust Bobby's reform agenda. Says it's bad for business. Asked me to keep my ears open when I'm with the brothers. July 1st. Bobby showed me classified files about atmospheric testing in Nevada. The cancer rates, the birth defects, it's all being covered up. He wants to go public, but Jack won't let him. Says it would destroy the party in 64. July 15th. Strange men following me. Bobby says it's routine security, but these aren't Secret Service. Frank's people maybe, or someone else entirely. The entries painted a picture of Monroe caught between competing forces. The Kennedy brothers, organised crime figures, and federal intelligence agencies. She had been privy to state secrets about nuclear testing, witnessed conflicts between the President and Attorney General, and apparently agreed to serve as an informal intelligence source for multiple parties. But it was the final entries that made Marcus's heart race. August 3rd. Can't take the pressure anymore. Everyone wants me to spy on everyone else. Bobby thinks I'm working for Frank. Frank thinks I'm too close to Bobby. Jack doesn't know about any of it, and maybe that's for the best. August 4th. Bobby came by tonight, very agitated about something in Cuba. Says there's going to be a crisis soon and he needs to know who he can trust. I told him about the men watching the house, about Frank's offers of protection. He got that look he gets when he's thinking about prosecuting someone. August 5th, 12:32 a.m. Jack called, drunk and rambling about Marilyn this, Marilyn that. Hung up on him. Bobby's still here, says he's going to take care of everything, that I don't need to worry anymore. But I am worried. I'm scared of what taking care of everything might mean. The final line, written in shaky handwriting, sent chills down Marcus's spine. Feels like I'm drowning and everyone's fighting over who gets to throw me the rope. Below that, in different ink and clearly added later, someone had written, "The thing they can't let out." Bobby knows about the bomb tests. Jack doesn't know Bobby knows. If this comes out, everything falls apart. Marcus stared at the screen, understanding finally dawning. Monroe hadn't just been a presidential mistress caught up in dangerous games. She had been a witness to fractures within the Kennedy administration that could have altered the course of American history. Her diary contained evidence of cover-ups, criminal connections, and sibling rivalries that powerful people had killed to protect. And now he was the only person alive who knew where to find that evidence. Marcus spent the weekend studying every frame of the diary microfilm, taking detailed notes and cross-referencing Monroe's entries with historical events. The picture that emerged was more complex and dangerous than anything he had imagined. Monroe had been systematically documenting her interactions with both Kennedy brothers, apparently at the suggestion of Bobby Kennedy himself. The Attorney General had been building a case against organised crime figures who were also connected to his brother's administration through shared romantic interests and political favours. But the diary revealed something even more explosive. Robert Kennedy had discovered that President Kennedy was being blackmailed by crime figures who had evidence of the president's extramarital affairs. The Attorney General's aggressive prosecution of organised crime wasn't just about justice. It was an attempt to eliminate people who could destroy his brother's presidency. Monroe had become a liability to everyone involved. She knew too much about too many secrets, and her emotional instability made her unreliable as either an asset or a co-conspirator. According to her final diary entries, she'd been planning to go public with what she knew about government cover-ups of nuclear testing damage. The diary's last entry, dated 1:15 a.m. on August 5th, 1962, was barely legible. Bobby's gone. Said he had to make some calls, handle the situation. Men outside getting closer to the house. I can hear them talking, but can't make out the words. Going to hide this reel behind the bedroom mirror. If something happens to me, maybe someone will find it and tell the truth. Marcus realised he was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that had claimed Monroe's life and shaped 6 decades of American history. The question was, what should he do with that knowledge? His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Unknown number. Mr. Webb? The voice was cultured, with a slight Eastern accent. I believe we need to talk. You've been doing some fascinating research lately. Marcus's mouth went dry. Who is this? A concerned party. Someone who appreciates thorough scholarship but worries about the consequences of certain discoveries. Are you free for lunch tomorrow? There's a diner on Sunset Boulevard called Mel's. Do you know it? I'm not sure I should. Oh, I think you should. 1 o'clock. Come alone and bring your appetite. We have a great deal to discuss. The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at his phone in the sudden silence of his apartment. The endgame was approaching, and he was being summoned to meet the people who had spent 60 years keeping Monroe's secrets buried. He looked at the microfilm canister sitting on his coffee table. Such a small thing to contain such enormous implications. Whatever happened at tomorrow's meeting, his life was about to change dramatically. Marcus spent the evening making copies of everything he had found, storing them in multiple locations as insurance. If something happened to him, he wanted to ensure that the truth wouldn't die with him. As he prepared for bed, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at a crossroads of history. Tomorrow, he would learn whether the truth about Marilyn Monroe's death was worth the price that others might demand he pay for possessing it. Mel's Diner on Sunset Boulevard was the kind of place where conversations happened in booths with cracked vinyl seats, and the constant background noise of frying food and clinking dishes provided natural cover for sensitive discussions. Marcus arrived at exactly 1 o'clock, scanning the restaurant for anyone who might be waiting for him. A man in an expensive grey suit raised his hand from a corner booth, gesturing Marcus over with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the kind of ageless features that suggested good genetics and better health care. His smile was warm and professional. "Mr. Webb, thank you for coming. Please, sit." The man's handshake was firm but not aggressive. "I'm David Morrison. I represent certain interests that have become aware of your recent research activities." Marcus slid into the booth across from him, noting how Morrison had positioned himself with a clear view of the entire restaurant. "What kind of interests?" "The kind that value stability and discretion above sensationalism and chaos." Morrison signalled the waitress and ordered coffee for both of them without asking Marcus's preference. "You've stumbled onto some very old materials, some very sensitive materials, and my associates are concerned about how you might choose to use them." "Your associates?" Morrison's smile never wavered. "People who worked very hard to ensure that certain events from 1962 were handled with appropriate delicacy. People who understand that some truths serve no useful purpose if revealed at the wrong time or in the wrong context." The coffee arrived and Morrison added cream with deliberate care. "Tell me, Mr. Webb, what do you think you've discovered?" Marcus had spent hours preparing for this moment, but now that it had arrived, he felt unprepared for Morrison's casual manner. The man seemed more like a friendly uncle than a government agent or criminal enforcer. "Evidence that Marilyn Monroe was murdered," Marcus said carefully. "That her death was covered up by federal agencies and organised crime figures working together to protect the Kennedy administration." Morrison nodded as if discussing the weather. "And what do you intend to do with this evidence?" "I haven't decided." "Good. That shows wisdom." Morrison reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila envelope. "Before you make any decisions, I'd like you to consider some additional information." The envelope contained photographs, surveillance images of Monroe's house on the night she died, taken from multiple angles. They showed several cars parked outside, men in suits moving purposefully between vehicles, and what appeared to be a coordinated operation unfolding over several hours. These were taken by a federal surveillance team that had been monitoring Monroe for several weeks, Morrison explained. As you can see, her death was indeed managed, but not for the reasons you might think. Marcus studied the photographs, trying to make sense of the timeline they suggested. Then why? Morrison leaned back in the booth, his expression growing serious for the first time. Marilyn Monroe was killed by a Soviet intelligence asset who had been using her relationship with the Kennedy brothers to gather information about American nuclear capabilities and Cuba policy. The diary you found contained some accurate information, but it was also being used to feed disinformation back to Moscow through Monroe's handlers. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. She was a spy. Unwittingly, yes, the Soviets had identified her relationships with the Kennedy brothers as a valuable intelligence opportunity. They cultivated assets within her social circle, people who gradually convinced her that she was serving American interests by documenting government activities. In reality, she was being used to steal state secrets. Morrison produced another document, a declassified intelligence report with most names redacted. When federal agencies discovered the operation, they had to make a choice: expose Monroe as a Soviet asset and create a massive scandal that would destroy the Kennedy administration, or handle the situation quietly and preserve national security. Marcus felt the foundations of his investigation crumbling beneath him. "So you killed her to protect the government?" "We didn't kill anyone," Morrison said firmly. "The Soviet asset who had been running Monroe eliminated her when it became clear that American intelligence had discovered the operation. Our people arrived too late to prevent her death, but in time to manage the aftermath. And the cover-up was necessary to prevent World War III. If the American public had learned that the Soviets had been using a movie star to spy on the president during the Cuban Missile Crisis, The pressure for military retaliation would have been overwhelming. Millions of people might have died because of that woman's naivety. Morrison's narrative was compelling, but Marcus sensed gaps in the story. What about the diary? The references to nuclear testing cover-ups? Disinformation designed to turn Monroe against the administration. The Soviets wanted her to believe she was fighting government corruption when she was actually stealing national security secrets. Morrison's voice grew cold. The woman was a patriotic American who was manipulated by foreign agents into betraying her own country. She died because those agents decided she had become a liability. The diner suddenly felt too warm, too crowded. Marcus loosened his tie, struggling to process everything Morrison had told him. If it was true, then his investigation hadn't uncovered a government conspiracy. It had stumbled onto a Cold War intelligence operation that had been successfully buried for 6 decades. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. Morrison reached into his jacket again and produced a cashier's check. Even from across the table, Marcus could see that it was made out for $250,000. "Because you deserve to know the truth before making a decision that could affect national security," Morrison said. "And because certain parties believe you should be compensated for your discretion in this matter." Marcus stared at the check. "You're offering to buy my silence." "We're offering to reward your patriotism. The Soviet operation failed because people like you, dedicated civil servants who care about their country, were willing to keep dangerous secrets buried." Morrison's voice grew more intense. "The Cold War never really ended, Mr. Webb. It just went underground. The same forces that killed Marilyn Monroe are still operating today, still trying to destabilize American democracy through disinformation and chaos. And if I refuse?" Morrison's smile returned, but it was colder now. "Then you'll publish your findings and create exactly the kind of chaos those foreign agents want. You'll destroy faith in American institutions, validate conspiracy theories that make rational discourse impossible, and hand our enemies a propaganda victory they couldn't achieve through military force." The envelope also contained legal documents, a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would legally bind Marcus to silence about everything he had discovered. The terms were generous but absolute. $250,000 in exchange for surrendering all copies of the materials he'd found and agreeing never to discuss or investigate Monroe's death again. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Marcus asked. "How do I know this isn't just another layer of the cover-up?" Morrison reached for his phone and activated a recording app. The audio quality was poor, clearly from an old surveillance tape, but the voices were distinguishable. An elderly man with a slight accent spoke in careful, measured tones. "The empty bottle? Yes, I remember. We had to make it look like suicide by overdose, but the real cause was injection. Quick-acting paralytic agent developed by our chemical section. She never knew what was happening." And the diary pages? Photographed before disposal. Some authentic entries mixed with material we provided through her handler. American intelligence fell for it completely. They thought they were protecting their precious Kennedy boys when really they were helping us eliminate a compromised asset. Morrison stopped the recording and put away his phone. Kenneth Yamamoto, recorded in 1983 during a debriefing with defected Soviet intelligence officers. He wasn't intimidated by our people, Mr. Webb. He was being interviewed by them. The breathing difficulties that hospitalized him last week were induced by a foreign agent who wanted to silence him before he could reveal the truth about his role in Monroe's death. Marcus felt sick. Yamamoto was working for the Soviets. A sleeper agent placed in the coroner's office years before Monroe became a target. When their operation was exposed, Soviet intelligence decided to eliminate all evidence, including Monroe herself, and eventually the agents who had carried out the operation. Morrison's expression was grim. "The man you spoke with last week wasn't a heroic witness to government corruption. He was a foreign spy who helped murder an American citizen, and then spent 60 years living comfortably on a government pension while keeping his mouth shut." The revelation shattered Marcus's understanding of everything he thought he had uncovered. If Morrison was telling the truth, then Marcus hadn't discovered a conspiracy. He had stumbled into the middle of an ongoing intelligence war where American secrets were still being protected from foreign enemies. "The microfilm," Marcus said weakly, "the diary entries. contained enough authentic material to be convincing, mixed with disinformation designed to make American intelligence agencies look corrupt and incompetent. Classic Soviet tactics. Morrison leaned forward. "You found exactly what they wanted someone to find, Mr. Webb. The question is, are you going to help them complete their mission?" Marcus stared at the cashier's check, at the NDA, at the photographs that seemed to support Morrison's version of events. Everything he had believed about his investigation was crumbling, replaced by a narrative that was both more complex and more disturbing than any conspiracy theory. "I need time to think," Marcus said. "Of course." But not too much time. Morrison stood and dropped a $20 bill on the table. "There are other parties interested in this information, and they're not as generous or as patient as we are. Make the right choice, Mr. Webb, for your country and for your own sake." Marcus drove home in a daze, Morrison's words echoing in his mind. Everything he thought he had discovered about Monroe's death had been turned upside down. Instead of uncovering a government conspiracy, he had apparently walked into a decades-old intelligence operation that was still active. But something about Morrison's story bothered him. The man had been too prepared, too polished, with evidence that conveniently supported his narrative. After 18 years in the archives, Marcus had developed an instinct for detecting fabricated documents, and some of the materials Morrison had shown him had felt wrong, too clean, too perfectly aligned with the story being told. Back in his apartment, Marcus spread out all his research materials and began examining them with fresh eyes. If Morrison was lying, there should be inconsistencies in his narrative, details that didn't match the evidence Marcus had independently discovered. The first discrepancy was in the timeline. Morrison claimed that Soviet agents had killed Monroe when their operation was exposed, but the wiretap summaries Marcus had found suggested that organised crime figures had been discussing Monroe's death before it happened. If the Soviets were responsible, why were American criminals involved in planning the cover-up? The second problem was Kenneth Yamamoto's story. Morrison claimed the old man was a Soviet sleeper agent, but Yamamoto's personnel file showed he had been thoroughly vetted when he joined the coroner's office, including a background check that went back to his childhood in a Japanese-American internment camp during World War II. It was possible, but unlikely, that Soviet intelligence could have placed an agent so deep in American society so early. The third inconsistency was the most troubling. Morrison had claimed that American intelligence agencies had been deceived by Soviet disinformation, but the cross-reference card Marcus had found suggested that federal agencies had been actively involved in managing Monroe's file from the beginning. If they were being fooled, why were they coordinating the cover-up? Marcus realised he needed more information before making any decisions. He called the hospital where Yamamoto was being treated, using his official credentials to inquire about the patient's condition. "Mr. Yamamoto was discharged this morning," the nurse informed him, "released to family care. Can you give me a contact number for his family?" "I'm sorry, but there's no family listed in his file. He was picked up by representatives from a private care facility." Marcus felt a chill. Yamamoto had been taken somewhere by unknown people, just hours after Morrison had revealed the old man's alleged role as a Soviet agent. Either Morrison's story was true, and American intelligence was protecting a valuable defector, or Yamamoto was being silenced permanently to prevent him from contradicting Morrison's narrative. That evening, Marcus made a decision that would either save his life or end it. He called the number Morrison had given him and arranged another meeting, but this time he would be recording the conversation and asking much more specific questions. They met at a different location, a parking garage downtown where Morrison's voice would echo enough to mask any recording equipment Marcus might be carrying. The federal agent seemed more relaxed this time, confident that his previous arguments had been persuasive. "Have you made a decision, Mr. Webb?" "I'm leaning toward accepting your offer," Marcus lied smoothly, "but I need to understand a few more details before I sign anything. For instance, how did Soviet intelligence initially recruit Monroe as an asset?" Morrison seemed pleased by the question. "Through her psychiatrist, a man named Ralph Grayson. The Soviets had compromised him years earlier using financial pressure and blackmail. He gradually convinced Monroe that she was serving American interests by documenting her interactions with the Kennedy brothers. And the organised crime connections? How do they fit into a Soviet operation? The Soviets used existing criminal networks to maintain plausible deniability. If the operation was exposed, it would look like a mob hit rather than foreign espionage. Morrison's explanation was smooth and confident. Very sophisticated tradecraft. Marcus nodded as if satisfied, but internally he was noting another problem with Morrison's story. Ralph Grayson had been Monroe's psychiatrist, but he was also a respected member of the psychoanalytic community with no known criminal or intelligence connections. It would have been extremely difficult for foreign agents to compromise him without detection. What about the diary microfilm? How did it end up in the Federal Archives if it was Soviet disinformation? Our people recovered it during the cleanup operation and kept it as evidence of the Soviet infiltration. It was supposed to be destroyed years ago, but bureaucratic incompetence led to it being misfiled instead. Morrison shrugged. Government efficiency at work. But Marcus knew that wasn't true either. The microfilm canister had been labelled and filed according to standard federal archival procedures, not hastily misfiled during a crisis. Someone had deliberately preserved Monroe's diary photographs and hidden them where they might eventually be discovered. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Morrison providing increasingly elaborate explanations for every inconsistency Marcus raised. By the end, Marcus was convinced that Morrison was lying about almost everything, but he still wasn't sure what the truth actually was. "I'll need the weekend to review the legal documents," Marcus said finally. "Can I call you Monday with my decision?" "Of course. But don't wait too long. Other parties are becoming impatient and they may not be as generous as we are." As they parted ways, Marcus noticed that Morrison's casual confidence had been replaced by something harder and more calculating. The federal agent was beginning to suspect that Marcus wasn't as convinced as he pretended to be. Marcus spent the weekend conducting his own investigation into David Morrison, using public records and online resources to trace the man's background. What he found was disturbing. Morrison existed in official records, but his history was suspiciously clean, and his government connections were vague and difficult to verify. More importantly, Marcus discovered that Morrison's story about Kenneth Yamamoto being a Soviet agent was completely fabricated. The old man's military service records showed he had served with distinction in Vietnam, and his decades of work at the coroner's office had been exemplary. There was no evidence whatsoever of foreign intelligence connections. Marcus realized that Morrison was part of a different kind of conspiracy. Not Soviet espionage, but an ongoing American operation to suppress information about Monroe's death that could still damage powerful interests 60 years later. But if Morrison was lying about Soviet involvement, what was the real truth about Monroe's death? Marcus returned to the diary microfilm with fresh eyes, this time focusing not on the political implications but on the personal relationships Monroe described. The picture that emerged was of a woman caught between competing American power structures, political, criminal, and intelligence, all of whom had been using her for their own purposes. The Kennedy brothers hadn't been innocent victims of Soviet manipulation. According to Monroe's own words, they had been actively using her as an informal intelligence source, asking her to report on organised crime figures she encountered through her Hollywood connections. At the same time, those same crime figures had been pressuring her to spy on the Kennedys. Monroe's death hadn't been the result of foreign espionage. It had been the inevitable outcome of domestic power struggles that had spiralled out of control. Armed with this understanding, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of accepting Morrison's offer or going public with his discoveries, he would set a trap to expose the people who were still actively covering up Monroe's murder. Monday morning, Marcus called Morrison and arranged to meet that afternoon to sign the NDA and accept the financial settlement. But instead of going to the meeting, he spent the day making copies of all his evidence and distributing them to multiple journalists, historians, and government oversight organisations. By the time Morrison realised he had been deceived, it would be too late to suppress the information. Marcus also prepared a detailed written account of his investigation, including recordings of his conversations with Morrison and evidence of the ongoing cover-up activities. He uploaded everything to multiple cloud storage services and sent encrypted copies to trusted contacts with instructions to release the information if anything happened to him. At 3 p.m, Marcus called Morrison from a payphone outside the city. "I've decided not to accept your offer," he said simply. There was a long pause before Morrison responded, and when he did, his voice had lost all pretense of friendliness. "That's unfortunate, Mr. Webb. Very unfortunate indeed. I've made copies of everything and distributed them to people you can't reach or intimidate. If anything happens to me or to Kenneth Yamamoto, the whole story goes public immediately." "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Morrison said coldly. "This goes far beyond Monroe, far beyond the Kennedys. There are national security implications you can't possibly understand. Then maybe it's time those implications were discussed in public instead of hidden in government vaults." Marcus hung up and drove to a safe location, a hotel in a different city where he could monitor news coverage and wait to see how Morrison's people would respond to his ultimatum. The answer came within hours. Every news organisation Marcus had contacted received simultaneous visits from federal agents who confiscated the materials he'd provided, claiming they contained classified information related to ongoing national security operations. The journalists were threatened with prosecution under the Espionage Act if they published anything about Monroe's death. But Marcus had anticipated this response. His most important evidence had been sent to international news organisations and academic institutions beyond the reach of American intelligence agencies. The story would come out, just not in the way he had originally planned. 3 days after Marcus's ultimatum, Kenneth Yamamoto was found dead in a private care facility outside Los Angeles. The official cause of death was listed as complications from respiratory failure, but no autopsy was performed, and the body was cremated within 24 hours. Marcus received the news through an encrypted message from one of his contacts, along with a warning that federal agents were actively searching for him. Morrison's people had decided that the threat Marcus posed outweighed any concerns about drawing attention to their activities. From his hotel room, Marcus watched as the story began to break in the international media. British newspapers published excerpts from Monroe's diary. German television aired interviews with intelligence experts who validated the documents, and academic conferences around the world began discussing the implications of what Marcus had discovered. The American media remained largely silent, but social media exploded with speculation and conspiracy theories. The official response from government agencies was predictable. They claimed the documents were fabrications designed to undermine public confidence in American institutions. But Marcus had one more card to play. Hidden among the materials he had distributed was a single photograph that would change everything. An image from the federal surveillance of Monroe's house on the night she died, showing a young man in a suit entering the building at 11:30 p.m. and leaving at 2:15 a.m. The man in the photograph was Robert Kennedy. When this image was published by a Swiss newspaper, it created an international sensation that no amount of government pressure could contain. The Attorney General of the United States had been present when Marilyn Monroe died, and federal agencies had spent 60 years covering up that fact. Within a week, congressional hearings were announced, federal archives were subpoenaed, and the Monroe case was reopened for the first time since 1982. Morrison and his associates found themselves under investigation rather than controlling it. But Marcus knew that his victory had come at a tremendous cost. Kenneth Yamamoto was dead, along with who knew how many other witnesses over the years. The truth about Monroe's death was finally emerging, but it was being purchased with blood. From his hiding place, Marcus watched as the story evolved beyond his original investigation. New witnesses came forward, additional documents were declassified, and the full scope of the cover-up began to emerge. Monroe's death had been just one incident in a larger pattern of government abuse that stretched across decades. The official narrative that finally emerged was more complex than any conspiracy theory. Monroe had indeed been murdered, but not by a single conspiracy. She had been killed by representatives of organised crime who feared she would expose their connections to the Kennedy administration. Federal agencies had covered up the crime not to protect the killers, but to prevent a scandal that could have brought down the government during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Both sides had been guilty of placing political considerations above justice, and both had been willing to sacrifice an innocent woman to protect their interests. 6 months after Marcus's investigation began, he testified before a closed session of the Senate Intelligence Committee. providing a detailed account of everything he'd discovered and everyone he'd encountered during his research. The committee's final report, heavily redacted but still explosive, confirmed most of Marcus's findings while adding new details that painted an even darker picture of government complicity in Monroe's death and its aftermath. Morrison and several of his associates were indicted on charges related to obstruction of justice and conspiracy to suppress evidence. Some were convicted and sentenced to prison, while others disappeared into the Federal Witness Protection Program or fled to countries without extradition treaties. Kenneth Yamamoto was posthumously vindicated, revealed to have been exactly what he claimed, an honest civil servant who had tried to do the right thing and been silenced for his efforts. The Monroe case was officially reclassified as an unsolved homicide, though everyone involved knew that the real perpetrators were long dead. The focus shifted to holding accountable the people who had spent 6 decades covering up the crime. Marcus returned to his job at the coroner's office, but his role had fundamentally changed. He became the unofficial guardian of transparency, ensuring that sensitive cases were handled with proper oversight and that evidence was preserved rather than suppressed. The archive where he worked was renamed the Kenneth Yamamoto Memorial Archive, and new protocols were established to prevent the kind of cover-up that had hidden Monroe's murder for so long. But Marcus knew that the victory was incomplete. Powerful people still had powerful secrets, and the machinery of government secrecy was still operating in ways that the public never saw. Monroe's case had been exceptional, only in that someone had finally been brave enough and persistent enough to challenge the official narrative. Late at night, alone in the archive that had become both his sanctuary and his burden, Marcus sometimes wondered how many other files contained hidden truths that would never see the light of day. How many other Kenneth Yamamotos had died to protect secrets that served no legitimate purpose? How many other Marilyn Monroes had been sacrificed on the altar of political expediency? The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal dirge, casting everything in that familiar shade of institutional yellow. But now Marcus saw the archive differently, not as a repository of the dead, but as a guardian of truth waiting for the right person to ask the right questions. In the end, that was all it had taken to bring down a 60-year conspiracy. One person willing to look closely at evidence that everyone else had been trained to ignore. The truth about Marilyn Monroe's death was finally known, but Marcus understood that it was just one thread in a much larger tapestry of secrets that continued to shape American society in ways that most people would never understand. As he locked the file cabinet and prepared to leave for the night, Marcus reflected on the price that had been paid for truth, and the price that would be paid for future truths. Kenneth Yamamoto's sacrifice had not been in vain, but it had been a stark reminder that some knowledge came with a cost that few people were willing to pay. The archive fell silent except for the humming of the lights and the soft whisper of air through the ventilation system. In the darkness between the filing cabinets, the ghosts of American history waited patiently for the next brave soul to ask the questions that powerful people preferred to leave unanswered. Ben Norton had done his part to honour the dead by revealing how they had truly died. Now it was up to others to ensure that such secrets would not be buried so deeply or guarded so ruthlessly in the future. The truth about Marilyn Monroe was finally free, but the struggle for truth itself would continue long after the fluorescent lights went dark and the archive fell silent. In the end, that was the real lesson of the Kennedy cut, that democracy depended not on the wisdom of leaders or the efficiency of institutions, but on the courage of ordinary people to seek truth, even when that truth was dangerous to know. The file room had yielded its secrets, but somewhere in the vast machinery of government, new secrets were being created that would someday require new heroes to expose them. The eternal cycle of truth and concealment would continue as it always had, as it always would, until the day when transparency finally triumphed over secrecy, and the people could trust their government to tell them the truth about their own history. That day had not yet come, but Ben Norton had moved it a little closer,